Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We have with us Simon Lamb. Simon is many things, works in fine arts and many other areas, but most importantly has written a fantastic book called Junglenomics. And what Simon is trying to do is to tackle one of the thornier problems we've seen in the entire environmental sustainability area, which is what do we do about markets and environmental services? And we're here today to talk about creating the world's first market in environmental services and how we can conserve the world's high conservation value areas forever. That's really the topic today. Now, you know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors as yet, and it really is a privilege to be able to introduce so many of these webinars, and I can only do so thanks to the wide-ranging interest, but also the tolerance of our sponsors who do allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And this has been a big year in some quarters for the combination of finance with these environmental issues. But Simon is going to highlight one very thorny area which is yet to be resolved. And we'll have a good conversation about that after his presentation. So just as a reminder of the format today, I'll be getting out of the way as quickly as I possibly can and leave things to Simon for 20 minutes or so. And then we'll have about 20 minutes of Q&A. So 3 quick points, if I might. First, you participate in the conversation by entering your questions, comments, observations, what have you, into the chat room, and I'll feed them into a conversation here with Simon. Secondly, yes, the slides will be available. They might be available during this presentation, but if not, they'll be available very shortly thereafter. And yes, this is being recorded, and the recording will be up in approximately 2 working days, so probably sometime on Friday. I will say that all of the questions, comments, and observations that you send in will be sent to Simon, and the way that this go-to system works, your email will be attached. So if you want to contact him, comment, offer help or advice or ideas, or just ask him to prove something, please go right ahead and type that in. If we don't get time for all of those questions and comments, nevertheless, Simon will receive them afterwards. So with no more ado, if I may, Simon, the floor is very much yours, and we're just going to transfer control over to you now. But just before we do so, Simon, you wanted to ask our audience a poll, didn't you?
I did indeed, yes. The poll is that 11.1 million hectares of tropical primary forests were lost in 2021. And how much CO2 do you think this released?
Okay, folks, well, you've got the question in front of you. Simon, one of the great things about the FS Club members is that they are very swift with their opinions, and in fact, half the people have already voted. So we'll just leave it open for another 5 or 10 seconds. It's great, up to 3/4 of the audience, and that's super. We'll just pull that and show the results. So the audience came down almost half on 4.5 gigatons. But you're going to put us out of our misery. What's the correct answer?
It's 2.5 gigatons, representing that 11.1 million hectares is an area about the size of Cuba. So it gives you some idea just what happened in 2021 alone.
The size of Cuba, my gosh. That's outrageous. Well, okay, Peter is just transferring control over to you of the slides. Oh, that's great. I mean, we can see your slides perfectly, Simon.
Great.
And so over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for a kind introduction. Before starting on the actual nitty-gritty of the bond market I'm proposing, I'll provide a little context. What are environmental services and why are they so valuable? Nature provides environmental, social, economic services worth trillions of dollars annually to the world economy. And here are some of the main important services that they provide. As you can see, they are absolutely essential: climatic and atmospheric regulation, water purification, and they're also important for biopharmaceuticals. That's medicines, cancer, diabetes, and much more yet to be discovered. Obviously, carbon capture and sequestration is something I probably don't have to tell you about. It's been in the news so much, but it is a massive contributor. And I'm going to be referring to HCVA interchangeably with forests, because HCVAs high conservation value areas, and that incorporates other areas like mangroves and fishing nurseries and so on. But this bond is dedicated to tropical rainforest. And if you look down here on the bottom left, the thing we should never forget is the number of people who are being given a very hard time in many places, and they depend entirely for their livelihoods on rainforests, tropical rainforests. And that figure is actually pretty low, because if you add the full figure, people who actually live around the outsides and also depend on rainforests, it's getting on towards 2 billion people. That's a huge number of people. So soil structure, maintaining pollination is another obviously extremely important contributor towards food production, without which most food production would simply cease. So despite those obvious things of such obvious value, the rainforest destruction goes on undiminished. It's under constant attack, and that attack comes from markets. You can see that this is a general slow uptrend, and the latest I have that in April's figures for tropical rainforest destruction this year are the worst on record. So I hate to think what 2021. And remember, this is a finite, this is a loss that's continuing, but this is a finite asset. It runs out in the end. This will have to decline as there's less and less left of it. And I just want to give you an analogy. If you imagine that you were in the remote future on a colony on a remote planet, very inhospitable, living under a huge dome, and inside that dome there is a great tower with the mechanics within, built of small bricks, which together produce your life support system, your air, your water, and condition the temperature for you. And you walk past it every day, thanking God that it's there. And one day you walk past and you hear a little noise round the back, and you go around the back, and there is a gigantic hole in the back of it, at the base of it. And there are lots of people, and they've got drills and pickaxes and wheelbarrows, and they're helping themselves to these bricks. And you know that somewhere there'll be that one brick, which will be the tipping point brick. And that's basically where we are today. It is as serious as that. So why is this happening? And the answer is really quite simple. It is simply a matter of market valuation. Primary forests are fatally exposed to extractive exploitation. And the main ones you see here, logging, fossil fuel minerals, agriculture is by far the biggest. In all its forms, it is something like 80% of the total. And then in the seas, there's industrial scale license and illegal fishing. A lot of it is licensed fishing, but massive overfishing. And whereas markets assign nothing, there is no market for environmental services, which are so precious, as we can see. They assign massive value to fossil fuels, metals, minerals, and rare earths, and so on. And it's left out of, environmental services are left out of the equation. So what's being done at the moment? Governments have pledged, as we know, over and again to stop deforestation. Regulation works to some degree, but it really doesn't work. It all depends on who's operating it and how determined they are. And as we know, the present president of Brazil takes not much notice and basically encourages people to break the law. And as a result, 95% of Brazilian rainforest destruction is illegal. Other countries do a kind of three-card trick. They sort of shift the things around, so they refer to net deforestation targets, and then their net deforestation targets don't look so bad, and they often get bond loans for this kind of reforestation. But it allows the destruction of very valuable biodiversity-rich primary forest with this impoverished monoculture, and you can see a typical one on the picture on the right. In the end, there really is no plan big enough to achieve what we have to do. There is nothing. There's lots of small things, but no big plan. The red plus scheme, which some of you may have heard about, is the best thing that's out there. And I have to say it's a lot better than nothing. But as many people agree who know about it, it is deeply flawed in ways that are too complicated to go in right now. But I mustn't forget to mention the many small schemes and initiatives that are doing fantastic work. There's some really good work going on by some very, very good people, but they are small, often fragile and insecure. And in the end, you hear some good news stories, and I love reading good news stories, don't doubt it, but you look at those statistics, and at the end of the year, that tells you what's happening. Not what we want to happen, but it's what's really happening. So how do we continue to benefit from these essential services way into the future? And not just a temporary fix, but a permanent fix, because it is time for a permanent fix. And I'm sure we all agree that we're rushing from pillar to post is not going to last. So this is the beginning of the main presentation now. And so I'm asking this question and repeating that major market failures are afflicting natural resource management. And so the proposal is for a new market-oriented vehicle, which is basically to make forest and other HCVA more valuable intact than not. Because at the moment, like the bricks in that tower, they're worth more for the bricks than they are for the tower. And we need that tower. So this is hugely scalable, unlike most other projects. It really is enormously scalable, and it should create its own momentum, because I believe it would be, and from conversations with people, extremely popular in the markets. So the main objectives are to protect millions of hectares of HCVA, carbon sequestration, and it also has an element to restore and conserve degraded HCVA that's adjacent to high quality wildlands. But it has another element to it, because the problem for emerging economies is they have enormous debt. It's kind of endemic, the debt, and COVID has made that worse. Interest rates are now rising. The last thing they can do is say, well, all this land that we can cash in on, we're going to conserve it because some Western guys have come and told us that we ought to do it. They need inward investment, and they need to formally establish the rights of indigenous communities. And this bond has all that built into it. So steps to achieve this. The first thing is create that market, and you create market by applying bonds to specific grid parcel areas of land. We'll see in a second how that actually works mechanically. We then need an income to make the bond valuable, to give the bond value, without which it's just like the rainforest, it's just a bond with nothing in it. It becomes a voluntary purchase. So here it makes it valuable by directing an income from developed nations. It has to be underwritten by an international treaty. We have to have very, very clear, I mean, bond markets are sensitive to the safety of their money, as you would expect. And so you need a treaty that nations who want to participate sign up to make sure those relations are properly governed. You need a robust governance framework within that, so that you actually, in the case, as you'll see, it is run by trusts. And then you also need MRV, which is monitoring, reporting, and verification, to provide the oversight that's needed to actually see on the ground what's happening. Prioritization of indigenous peoples, I can't repeat that often enough. And then, as we'll see, the coupon gets dedicated in a different way and a different version. So let's move on a second and just see the inputs and impacts. So On the top left up here, you have wealthy nations. On the right here, you have investors. They're providing the capital, wealthy nations providing the coupon. Capital markets filter that money down to the trusts, and then the developed, which are each developing country has its own trust and its own MRV network. And these are all the things that I've spoken about that are prioritized. So there are a lot of co-benefits to this. We'll look at the mechanics of it in a second. There are a lot of, for a start, it changes national perceptions, because at the moment governments see it as many emerging economy governments see it as just something they can cash in on when they need money, for timber, for agriculture, whatever it may be. It's basically expendable. Those are the bricks again in the tower, and it makes them say, "Well, hang on a minute. This is a bank. This is a bank with massive future value for us that we can keep cashing in on as long as we keep it in good condition." So it actually protects not just the immediate areas that are bonded, but areas beyond that, just as you would any savings, the family silver. It reverses one of the largest sources of carbon release. It also, because it's going to, under my jurisdiction, if it was for me to say, I would have it happening on the edge of high quality forest, because forest is known for spreading very rapidly across to adjacent areas, and recovery would be much quicker that way. Also, you've got a certain amount, quite a lot of fragmentation, isolated patches of rainforest, some of them reasonable size, and if you join those up, you get a double whammy from that. Leakage is always a problem when you try and say, well, you can't do this here, then they just go and do the same thing somewhere else. So the farming, there is an element to move the farming away to different areas to do much better farming practices, as we'll see again in a second. So debt-free finance to emerging nations to develop their green economies, because as you'll see, the bond allows this. And that means they pay no interest, they don't increase their debt. They have to bond their land in perpetuity, or there are penalties. But this again, through the trusts, is only dedicated to social infrastructure, hospitals, schools, and green development, such as green energy and so on. So, as in the title of this, it establishes the world's first formal purchase mechanism for ecosystem services. So designing the market, let's go on to the actual bonds. So there are two essential bonds. One is the ESI, which is the Environmental Service Investment Bond, and that is a treaty-bound permanent conservation. Now, this is for sovereign owners. This is for government land, where they have huge areas that they're constantly tipping into of HCVA. And you're saying to them, I'll show you the structure in just a second, the capital is distributed via the trusts and is debt and interest free. So this creates a lot of inward investment. And another co-benefit is that there will be a lot of opportunity for developed nations to help and gain contracts for this development will go on in these countries. It also benefits because there'll be less immigration for those countries. The reason Africans and South Americans are leaving in such quantities, particularly the young, is because there's no opportunities for them. So this helps create opportunities at home, develop their own economies rather than leaving them. So just to talk you through this, top left, you've got sovereign owners. You've got, they submit their pristine, in this case, forest. They sign up to the treaty, and next on the line, they have a land valuation. And that valuation, there is a mechanism for the land valuation. At the other end, you have the I'm going to call them the G39 nations. Actually, I only thought of this yesterday, but rather than G20, because it's 39 nations who've promised this 100 billion a year. So over here we have, this land is then submitted to the bond market and fully packaged and ready to go. The investors in the center here spend their capital buying it, and the GCF, I've used the GCF because they are the channel for the funds at the moment, fund the coupon, direct the coupon to investors. So they receive their coupon. And I've rated it at 2.5%. And I think that by international agreement, that could be tax-free, and about 0.25% would go for all the costs involved. And then across to the left, the capital goes here to the trust for conservation and sustainable development. So that's the ESI bond. The ESO bond is it's different. It's an offset bond. This is for restoration of HCVA, and they are linked to regeneration of destroyed HCVA. For example, these huge soy farms and so on, which lose fertility, and that's why they get abandoned. They always take more forest because they need more and more inputs. But the soil structure is very thin. So companies that have maximized, and it's important, their in-house carbon reduction, they then can buy ESOs to offset remaining emissions. And the capital in this case is allocated to buy the farms adjacent to pristine HCVA and relocate their damaging farming activities. So they may just be selling out entirely, but there is an incentive to start regenerative farming elsewhere, which we'll come to. The coupon is channeled via the trust, and I'm just going to move on because ESO bonds eventually mature into ESIs. Let's just see how that looks in practice. So sovereign private owners, they sell their degraded HCVA. There's the treaty, the land valuation, the same process. And they submit it to this ESO bond market. Now, going to the bottom here where the coupon goes, the G39, instead of going, the finance going as they do in the ESIs, straight up into the investors, this goes in this direction here and pays for the HCVA restoration process, which I have to say indigenous peoples are expert at. There's a lot of interesting stuff online about how expert they are at restoring rainforests. So the capital transfers across here, either for the purchase of the land or relocation of sustainable farming. And the incentive to encourage farmers to do that is that they would get carbon credits as well, which are saleable in the market, so an additional bonus for them. So the restoration trajectory, which is important, you can see that it goes from, it's acquired by the trust, it gets graded. Now, grade 1 is ESI, that's pristine. So grades 2 to 4 go through from partially destroyed to totally eradicated biodiversity and so on. They go through restoration phases, and after, which are sort of 5-yearly assessments, and eventually, and there's no income for the holders because what they're getting is the value of the offsets. But they are getting a capital gain. So every year, every 5 years, as its grade is increased, its value is increased, and its coupon therefore increases because it's on a percentage basis. And eventually, they reach grade 1 ESI status, and that status turns them into ESIs, and then the whole thing changes. They become ESIs. The coupon, we go back to the earlier chart, and the coupon gets paid to them, no longer paid to the communities who are doing the restoration. So at that point, the transfer of title goes to the community, to community trusts, away from the more national trusts who are overseeing this. And there is another contract for them in order to replace that lost income. So this is the final version. It's not a market version. It is Environmental Service Provision Contracts, ESPCs. And in this arrangement, the annual income, where annual income is required, and this is where, for example, the red scheme just doesn't touch the sides. It is for vast areas, and I know of specific areas like the Weiwei in Guyana who struggle to look after land that they own, a very, very high quality forest, because of incursions. They don't have the money, they don't have the training, they don't have the technology or the education. They are crying out for support. Now, if they can sell those environmental services to the G39, as we should be doing, and it would not be expensive, relatively expensive, then that provision contract, and they sign the treaty as well, will transfer to the indigenous peoples who are the guardians and stewards of that land. So there we have them. The sovereigns can be involved in this as well, submitting it to the treaty, land valuation in exactly the same way, and then all the way back to the community trusts. The G39 allocates the 2.5% of that valuation to the community trusts, and they're therefore able to maintain their land and provide environmental services, because remember, these services are world services. This is what's so important about recognizing this is not just a local issue. These services maintain the climate for all of us, and water flow and all those other things. So with that, I'm going to hand you back to Michael for any questions you might have.
Fantastic, Simon. You covered a lot of ground there. It's kind of interesting. You know, what I like about your proposal is that you've identified a market failure, and then you're trying to fix markets to fix it, which is, I think, eminent. And it reminds me of a slightly long quote I was digging out from Jeffrey Sachs in his 2008 book, Commonwealth. He talked about fish, and he said that he explored why the market price of fish didn't work. And the first reason is that the market price of a species will generally not reflect the species' societal value as part of Earth's biodiversity. So market prices do not reflect the value that society puts on avoiding the extinction of other species, only on the direct consumption value of those species, food, aphrodisiacs, whatever. Second, the rate of interest diminishes the incentive for the resource owner to harvest the resource at a sustainable rate. So if the value of the resource is likely to grow more slowly than the market rate of interest, the blaring market signal is to deplete the resource now and just pocket the money. And so, as you'd expect from that theory, it's slower growing animals and plants and forests that are especially endangered today. And he took as one example, slow growing megafish like orange ruffy. Their slow growth makes them a poor investment, even in managed fisheries, and their large size, of course, makes them an easy prey. So it's interesting what you're looking at here. I've got a question to go. There are a couple of comments here as well I'll be piling in, so please do bring in your comments, folks. But in this, what's the role, for example, of insurance? I mean, you alluded to a lot of the difficulties with RED and things like that. Doesn't insurance have a role to play here, that the land is actually guaranteed to be returned?
Absolutely. I mean, this is just an outline proposal, or there is a much fuller proposal, and insurance is very much mentioned in that. You will get, even if it's well policed, because it suddenly becomes so valuable by governments and by local people, you will get accidents and wildfires. And because these are grid reference, which gives a personal connection to people. So if you buy your bonds, you can actually go on Google Earth or whatever, and you can look down and say, well, there's the bit of forest that my bonds are protecting. And hang on a minute, one day I can see smoke rising from it. And this isn't anything that anybody's done deliberately. Yeah, I think that insurance will play a very important part there, and that is something that needs to be built into the model.
Okay. Now we have some real interest here in in Brazil. Christopher Williams asks, if Lula returns, will all of this make much difference? What could we all do to help him change the treatment of the Amazon region?
If who returns, sorry?
Lula.
Can you explain?
President Lula of Brazil.
Oh, President Lula. I'm so sorry. I think what happens is that all these people recognize money as being, it's behind everything, as we know. Economics is behind everything. I think you'll find that attitudes change. The moment he sees not a lot of wasteland, he sees sort of bars of silver when they're intact. There's no way that anybody in their right mind is going to, I'm not saying he's not necessarily in his right mind, but is going to ignore that fact. And it just changes perceptions entirely when they realize that they can get free capital for it, providing they keep conserving that land in perpetuity. Because these bonds are what's known as perpetual bonds. They are, or consols. They're more like shares, and they don't need repaying. So there's no time limit on them, and you can keep on rebonding, as it were, more and more of your land. So it's kind of, if he thought, well, yeah, I'm going to come back, we're going to start deforestation massively, people will be saying in his ear, hang on a minute, this stuff's worth a lot intact. Are we really wanting to do this? So making this market changes perceptions, in my view, will change perceptions as to the value of environmental services. They don't have to think about environmental services. They just know that these forests provide the services that G39 are prepared to pay for.
Okay. You said at the beginning, or close to the beginning of your presentation, that REDD+, REDD+, was deeply flawed, I think was what you said. And I know you didn't want to go into that in detail, but would you mind just elaborating a little bit so the audience gets what your concerns were there?
Well, that's a couple of the main concerns are that the cash goes through so many hands on its way to getting to the people that really need it that it gets heavily filtered. That's one. But one of the worst problem with it really is that it doesn't help people like the Wayway in Ghana, who are remote and not considered particularly threatened. It only helps the most threatened areas. That's good, but it leaves out these huge areas that then, when a road comes through, become immediately susceptible. And so it, in fact, has a perverse incentive built into it to actually threaten land in order to get the grant not to do it. It's a kind of protection money. And these events have been reported. But don't get me wrong, there's nothing else out there at the moment, and give me REDD+ any day rather than nothing.
Yeah, yeah. It's tough out there. I mean, we've seen, for example, in the voluntary carbon markets, just huge amounts of, frankly, fraud, let alone dodgy schemes, even well-meaning schemes where it hasn't been understood what it means to actually really set something aside permanently rather than sort of 25 years and cut the forest down again. And we see that even here in Britain on dracs and pellets and wood pellets and things like that, where we're not really accounting for things properly. Clive Bullen, picks up two points here, really. He's saying, in protecting some areas, for example, Brazil, won't that lead to other non-protected areas just being exploited instead? And he also would like you to comment on the risk that dodgy people at the top of government will just take lots of it themselves and not actually distribute it to the general public, sort of an extension of whispering in Lula's ear, take the money, Lula, yourself,
Well, on the, I did speak about so-called leakage. Leakage is prevented because every country can suddenly see that their intact HCVA has a value, and the incentives built into this make sure that farming is carried out elsewhere. I mean, people who have these farms bought off them can never farm close to those areas, certainly can never be responsible for forest clearance ever again. But the point about the leakage is that, again, it's this completely new concept that what is standing, there's a saying that, what pays stays, what costs is lost. And that's the opportunity costs. And forests at the moment are massive opportunity costs if they're not cut down. So I just think it changes the parameters entirely. And on the second question of corruption, absolutely. And that's why built into this is an international treaty. That's why all these funds are directed through trusts. So if you want a contract to build a school, you've got to submit it to the trust in the usual way. They will have very large sums of money to spend, and people who want to build schools, hospitals, wherever it might be, will need to come through the trust to do so. So no system is entirely foolproof. But that is exactly why there must be a treaty and there must be trust, because we need to minimize that corruption, because that does happen in the red scheme. There isn't enough oversight, in my view.
Henry Levinson Gower makes, I think, quite a subtle point. The question seems obvious, but as I've been thinking about it, his question runs, how does this scheme deal with uncertainty, particularly confer risk? We currently have limited understanding of relationships between land management and delivery of ecosystem services, so often actions don't deliver. And the reason I think there's a subtlety here, it's about learning. So many bond schemes and things that are set up tend to look at we know everything and we calculate a return, which is the kind of the debt investment versus sort of the equity investment. If I have no idea whether this is going to happen, it's a bit of a bet. How do you incorporate that kind of learning into your system?
The learning is always an ongoing process. It is advancing in leaps. I mean, companies like Nature Metrics, you may have heard of, they can actually measure from feces and DNA that's left behind. Rather than having, for example, on a stretch of river in a jungle, having to do an electrofish and count the number of species, they can actually do so through DNA. It's learning all the time, but you have to remember that it's never exact, but nature is incredibly resilient, and rainforests and nature will, given the chance, there's so many examples of this, will come back rapidly. So particularly if you've got indigenous peoples who are collecting the seeds and who know how to do those things, how you actually assess them, which is, I think, partly being alluded to, how do you then assess whether what you're after has been achieved, has to be done by ecologists, and there have to be certain metrics set. And there are, again, there's Vera, the ERRA, there is Gold Standard, who all specialize in reporting and seeing exactly what standards have been set. So the standards will be different for every piece of land. The biodiversity will be different, circumstances will be different, and there might be dry forest as opposed to rainforest or cloud forest. So everything is tailored, but you do have to set these targets so that the ESOs, the offsets, when they're going through their phases of improvement, you need to be able to say, somebody has to go along, ecologists have to go along and say, that has achieved that standard. So they will need metrics to achieve this standard. That's a detail that I would have to pass over to ecologists, and they would have to decide. But the knowledge on this is expanding so rapidly, and I'm sure that even by the time a pilot scheme got going, the knowledge would have increased. There's so much research going on in this area.
I happen to be personally involved as a patron of something called Pollinating London Together, which is looking at increasing pollination. So Ian Neal has asked an interesting question that I'm curious about the answer to as well. Ian says, I'm not clear on how environmental services such as pollination would actually be valued under your scheme. Would you mind elaborating on that?
No, those services are basically what I outlined there was all the services that nature provides us, and I then zeroed in on forests. So we know that that's another issue in Europe, for example, to do with the use of insecticides that are poisonous to bees and insects. And insecticides is another major problem. That is a very good point, but it is another issue because the rainforests themselves provide a large proportion of those services that were on that slide, but not all of them necessarily. There are pollination services in there, but they're not. And they are relevant to the small-scale farming that can still continue and does continue, like agroforestry in forest areas. So they are relevant to them, those services. But the point I was making is that nature makes a habitat, creates a habitat for the entire world in different things in different areas, and pollination is just a vital one. But you don't actually value pollination separately, and not in this model. This is about rainforests and about all the things they stand for and how to conserve them in perpetuity.
Okay. Henry Levinson Gower has actually come back again with a point, more an observation, I think. He says the fundamental question here surely is the impossibility of complete contracts. That, you know, how can a scheme allow for adaptability to circumstances? How will disputes be dealt with? How will power inequality be mitigated? And I think this has plagued a number of things on, and international agreements only get you so far, as we've seen in many, many other cases. So what are your thoughts on actually enforcing this stuff over time?
Well, again, the areas of land, we're talking about what happens within the economy when ESO money is diverted into ESI money is diverted into economy, and say, how do we make sure that that is spent the way it should be? And what happens if there are disputes? Well, behind it all, and it's there in the full proposal, is the World Court as the arbiter for disputes. So everything must have legal backing. There can't be any arbitrary decisions. Trusts must not be seen as giving orders to people. They have to work within their parameters. If there's a dispute like any other dispute in any other contract goes to court and gets decided there. As far as disputes on the management of the land are concerned, it is, if you know much about forest peoples, you know much about indigenous peoples, you realize that if you were to sign up with them as the guardians of this and stewards of these areas, that mostly they are already anyway, they just don't have facilities to do it properly. Yeah. You would not say to them, you must do this and you must do that, and if you don't do it, you're going to be in trouble, because they will say, well, in this area, this is traditionally what we always do. So the contract you have with them is going to, any possibility of dispute is going to be minimized by the flexibility of these contracts that basically allows them to do it, providing they are not, doing massive damage, and they will understand, no, we don't want to damage our ancestral forests. They actually have massive knowledge. So you would submit the contract to their greater knowledge, and any ecologists who would have to make their case if they wanted to try and force them for things to do differently. But I doubt that would happen. And disputes, again, would have to be decided in court.
Okay. We've kind of come to the end of time, and I'm getting thanks in, which is always a good sign. So folks, if anybody wants to contact Simon, you've seen his email, but also just type in here you'd like to be in touch. But I'd like to close on a question. If charity begins at home, perhaps novel financial schemes also begin at home. Is there an application of this approach here in Britain which we could use to demonstrate the efficacy of it? We've certainly got enough environmental issues of our own locally.
I think you could. The thing is that this model is based on something I call ecosystem economics, which is junglenomics in the book is just appropriation of it. And ecosystem economics means that these principles can be applied virtually anywhere. And it might look very, very different to apply it over here. It might look very different to apply it to oceans or to mangrove swamps, or wherever it is you're trying to protect. That would be a whole lot more work and another entire project to do. And I do feel that although not nearly enough is being done in this country, the Countryside Bill is making good steps in the right direction, and we just hope that our next leaders will continue and in fact accelerate that work. But yes, it's in principle, because it's based on ecosystem economics, you could adapt it to just about anything.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, this has been really fascinating. I really appreciate the time. Junglenomics is full of a large number of items. It's not a tome of disaster. It's a tome that tries to address the issues and propose solutions, which I think is enormously helpful. There's some other good things in there about the application of polluter pays principles and things like that we should be looking at. But Simon, I would like to thank you for coming on board. Before I do so properly, may I first thank our sponsors. I'm delighted that so many of you in this space are very keen on this, and I would point to a couple of things that have happened most recently, particularly with regards to the indigenous peoples. A lot of folks in finance, particularly oddly in Asia, Lab One and others have been publishing widely on how to make the SDGs really link to the local people without being sort of in the rarefied centers of Wall Street and the City of London. Second thing I'd like to do is to thank you, the audience. You've clearly engaged on this, which I appreciate. We do have a number of events coming up forward. It seems to be a bit of a sustainability month. Tomorrow we'll be talking about private equity and sustainability. On the 1st of September, the EU Sustainable Finance Regulations. So there's a lot coming forward on this as well. And it is obviously a debate we will keep having on green finance and related ESG issues. But most of all, Simon, our thanks to you. You've put a considered amount of thought, personal energy, and commitment into this, and I admire it. And I admire the fact that you're really trying to grasp and use market mechanisms to solve problems rather than sort of saying, well, it all needs to go out and we need some completely fresh approach to approaching things. We need to make markets work for the planet and for people. And I think you've done a great job in elucidating that. I have here a piece of forestry, which is my advanced technology to say thank you very much. We do applause on FS Club, I think. Hopefully that sound of that wood knelling is not the death knell, it's the bellophone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael.